parts and service counter at the Sears store in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Before this, I had had some other jobs. I had done babysitting and lawn mowing and things like that to earn money. But I was looking forward to getting a real paycheck. I still remember the shock when I opened up that first paycheck envelope and I saw how much of my money was being taken out for taxes. I now finally understood personally what everybody had been complaining about. Taxes. Oh, we sure do complain about that. Income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, inheritance taxes. Even when you buy a postage stamp, that's a tax, right? There's taxes that show up on our phone bills. And those taxes are always tied up with issues of politics, economics, and the government. All of those same things are part of the backstory underlying our scripture reading from Matthew today. First, we have the political situation. The Pharisees were the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders. And they functioned very much like political middlemen between the Roman Empire and the Hebrew people. Jesus often viewed the Pharisees as puppets of the empire because they were richly compensated for keeping the Hebrew people in line. On the other side of the Pharisees were the masses and the crowds. But because Jesus had gained such a large following and had drawn all of these crowds with his teachings, it was openly suspected that Jesus was the figurehead of a new movement by the Jews to overthrow the Roman government. After all, there were open rumors that he was the Messiah, the promised one of Israel, the one who would free the Hebrew people from the Roman oppression. So the underlying context of our scripture today is that both the Roman Herodians and the Pharisees wanted Jesus to be arrested for sedition. But in order to accomplish that, they needed some sort of proof, some sort of evidence. They needed Jesus to say something that would prove he was guilty against the authority of the government so that they could finally get rid of him for good. So in order to make sure they had powerful witnesses, the Pharisees brought along some of King Herod's own men so that they could hear what Jesus said firsthand. And so with all these witnesses present, the Pharisees began to set their trap with some flattery of Jesus. They began by praising him as a man of integrity, as one who speaks God's truth. The Pharisees reminded Jesus that because he viewed all people as equal, that he should pay no attention to that these were King Herod's men that were standing right there in the crowd, listening hard to every word he was saying. But that Jesus should just freely speak the truth about what he believed. And then the Pharisees pulled their question. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, the other context of this question was a bigger one, an economic one. And there were two sides to it. The first was the view of the people. Was it right to participate in your own oppression as a people by paying the Roman taxes and funding the very legions and government that is oppressing you? Should you pay the terribly high taxes that the Romans imposed by using the Roman economic system of their coins? Or should you just stick to the Hebrew barter and shekel system and work only locally? Work outside the Roman economy to get your food, clothing, and goods. The other view of the Romans' taxes was that of the Pharisees and Herod's men. The Romans had done a lot of things for the people. The aqueducts from the Romans brought in more water than ever before, and their roads made trade and transportation possible. Their building projects of public baths and public buildings were all huge improvements to the first century society. Using Roman coins to pay your debt was convenient, and it was also a way of buying into the Roman economic system to do more public good building projects. But on the religious side, using Roman coins had other implications. Since the days of Julius Caesar in 49 BC, Roman emperor's image had been stamped on all Roman coins. In an era without printing presses and without video, when the time to engage in portrait art was extremely expensive and rare, the image of the emperor on the coin was not just a nice thing to see, but the image itself was thought to contain some of the essence and personality of the subject. By putting the emperor's image on the coin itself was a container of a bit of the authority and of the government of the Roman Empire. And that authority was heightened when the portrait on the coin would openly depict or declare that the emperor was a god. Now, the coin that many collectors believe is the one referenced in this passage was a Tiberius denarius. And it was a Roman coin that was said to embody the spirit of the emperor, which said he was the son of a god. Such a coin would be absolutely blasphemous to a devout Jewish person. It's no wonder that Jesus had to ask for such a coin. He would never have wanted to carry one. But when they handed Jesus the coin, neither the Pharisees nor Herod's men were ready for Jesus' questions, nor for his enigmatic statement, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." And they were puzzled and flummoxed. They didn't know what to do with that answer. The Pharisees and King Herod's men left Jesus and went away, obviously disappointed that they had failed to entrap this rabble-rouser, Jesus. But what in the world did that answer mean? Now, that Jesus answered that day about giving to Caesar what is Caesar's has been the subject of many a sermon and many theologians' papers throughout the centuries. Stances and arguments about this statement vary all across the theological spectrum. On one end is the theological view is that what Jesus meant was that because all those Roman coins belonged to the emperor, because of course the coin had the emperor's picture on it, that you ought to return your money to the emperor. Because it belongs to him, you should pay all your taxes. But the other theological view, on the other end of the theological spectrum, is that because everything in this whole world belongs to God, including the metals that the money is made out of, that ultimately nothing belonged to the emperor, and so you were obligated to pay nothing in taxes. Now, in my view, I think that Jesus' answer was much more subtle, much more profound than either of these extreme interpretations. I think that what Jesus was saying to these religious leaders and to King Herod's men was a question that was very, very personal and very important. When those Pharisees were receiving those silver coins from the Roman government for their help in the oppression of their own people, they were participating in that system of oppression. The Pharisees had given up the care for their people, and they had given up their integrity in order to further the ends of the Roman government. Part of their very lives had been given up to Caesar. They were no longer completely God's servants, and they knew it. And on the other side, King Herod's men were also the enforcers of King Herod's cruel and often terrible policies. Remember, Herod was the king who had John the Baptist's head delivered on a platter. For these men to work for such a cruel and terrible king was a soul-destroying act. I can imagine that they perhaps had difficulty sleeping at night as they contemplated the morality of some of the things that they had been enforcing. The reason that Jesus' question to them held so much power was that it forced both the Pharisees and King Herod's men to examine themselves and to ask what part of themselves they had completely given over to Caesar and what part was left in order to do the good work of God. In the very same way, Jesus' question penetrates our hearts today. What part of us do we give over to being a good American citizen? Do we take the time to vote, to be active in the political process? Do we keep up with all the policies and the laws that are being passed and what's going on in local politics, both here in Plainfield Township and in Lansing and in Washington? Do we protest? Do we petition? Do we try to change those laws that are unfair? Or do we just simply let someone else worry about it? While we very much enjoy our fire protection and our police protection and our bridges and our roads, our libraries and our schools, are we willing to pay our fair share and pay our taxes for those amenities? Or do we just complain about our taxes and begrudge those construction workers and teachers and librarians a living wage? Jesus' answer holds the difficult truth that when we participate in a system, we have to pay our dues, whether that's in an organization like a church or a nonprofit, or else by enjoying the freedoms that we have in the United States. Everything comes with a price, and we are indeed obligated to pay it because of our very participation in being in that system. But what do you do if you disagree with your government or with your organization? Do you simply quietly submit to everything that they tell you to do? Now, the American Quakers have been in this very same quandary since the 1700s. You see, Quakers are pacifists. They do not believe in war. And they had a big moral problem when the American government would levy a specific war tax on the American people. Many Quakers refused to pay it. For their position of non-compliant opposition, they had to pay other consequences to the American government. And during World War II, many of these conscientious objectors were put to work with no pay at all in mental hospitals, national parks, and even as voluntary human test subjects by the government. These conscientious objectors were examples of how much protesting war could cost. Because whether you are part of the system or you're in protest to the system, there is always a price to be paid, either for your enjoyment of the benefits or your rejection of their excesses. So, in conclusion, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's is still a question we need to think about today. Have you even thought about it? Are we giving our lives over to God's service and paying the price and the consequences of that decision? Do we give to God and to our church what it is really worth to us? Or do we just give the church a little money that's left over? Do we sit back and enjoy the resources and the freedoms of our government? Are we making it a priority to participate in the political process? Or do we just ignore all of it? When we disagree with what a bank is doing or with what our government is doing, are we playing our part in changing things to make it better? Or do we let others carry that burden and carry all of that cost? In our scripture today, Jesus calls each of us to examine the systems that we are part of and the price that we have to pay in order to use them. Whether it's paying taxes or giving our lives over to God, each of us must examine our hearts and pay the price. Amen.